Listen up, because what I'm about to tell you is either the biggest conspiracy in music history or the craziest plot twist Hollywood has ever tried to sweep under the rug. Imagine this: the king of pop, the most powerful artist on the planet, gone in a single night. And now, years later, whispers are turning into screams. Janet Jackson herself just cracked the code and dropped a bomb that points directly at Jay-Z. Yeah, you heard that right. Mr. Empire State of Mind may have had his empire built on something way darker than catchy hooks and Beyoncé's halo. But here's the million-dollar question. Did Jay-Z actually plot against Michael Jackson? Or is this just another wild theory cooked up by the industry's shadow puppeteers? Well, buckle up, because the dots connect a little too perfectly. From shady business deals to backroom betrayals, from fake friendships to catalog wars worth billions, this isn't just about music, it's about power. And when power is on the line, people vanish, legacies get rewritten, and truth becomes the most dangerous song you'll ever hear. So stick around, because what Janet just revealed might flip everything you thought you knew about Michael's death upside down. Let us begin with the scandal that nobody thought would ever come out, in the open. The kind of story that sounds like a thriller more than reality. But when you connect the dots, it begins to look chillingly possible. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, was not only a superstar, but a man who had outsmarted the very people who thought they ran the music industry. A man who was bigger than any label, bigger than any executive, and bigger than the game itself. His catalog alone was worth more than entire corporations, and owning publishing rights to artists like the Beatles, Babyface, Mariah Carey, and even parts of Beyoncé's work gave him leverage that frightened billionaires. He was not just an entertainer. He was a businessman sitting on power so huge that it made the giants of the industry nervous. And according to Janet Jackson, her brother did not simply fall victim to an unfortunate overdose. He was deliberately surrounded, manipulated, and eventually set up by people who wanted to snatch away that power. The most shocking name she pointed to was Jay-Z, the self-proclaimed king of hip-hop, who apparently was not just competing with Michael, but allegedly plotting against him behind the scenes, weaving himself deeper into Michael's circle while building his own empire on the side. This is not about a rap rivalry or a musical disagreement. This is about business, control, and the kind of betrayal that rewrites history. To understand why this theory has legs, you need to rewind back to the early 2000s. Michael was still untouchable, his influence unmatched, but the allegations and scandals around him kept multiplying at suspiciously convenient times. Every time he gained ground in the industry, another headline appeared to drag his name through the mud. Insiders have long whispered that these scandals were not random but carefully orchestrated weapons designed to weaken his public image while he sat on a catalog worth hundreds of millions. Around this time, Jay-Z was climbing the ranks of not just hip-hop but business, building Rockefeller and then Roc Nation, aligning himself with Sony executives, and moving in spaces that once belonged to Michael. The summer of 2001 gave the world a glimpse of what looked like a friendly collaboration when Michael appeared at Summer Jam with Jay-Z, but according to those close to Michael, that was the very moment infiltration began. Behind the smiles and the applause, people were moving into Michael's life who did not belong there, and slowly his inner circle began to change. Family access became limited, suspicious new faces appeared, and Michael, who once controlled everything, suddenly seemed boxed in by handlers and advisors who did not share his best interests. And then we get to the strangest detail of all, the role of Conrad Murray, the doctor who would later be convicted for involuntary manslaughter in Michael's death. When Michael collapsed after being given a lethal dose of propofol, Murray did not immediately call 911. Instead, reports claim he called a man named Fahim Muhammad. Now, who exactly was Fahim Muhammad? Not a doctor, not emergency services, but the bodyguard of none other than Diddy. The fact that he was allegedly the first person contacted in Michael's most critical moment raises disturbing questions about what really went on that night. Why would a bodyguard tied to Diddy be brought into the picture at all? For years, whispers have circled in the industry that Fahim was not just a bodyguard, but a fixer, a cleaner, the man you called when a mess needed to be covered up. To see his name linked to Michael's final hours is enough to make even skeptics pause. But the bigger question still hangs over this story. Why would Jay-Z and Diddy, two of the most powerful moguls in music, even want Michael gone? The answer keeps circling back to power and money. Michael's ownership of Sony ATV's publishing catalog gave him influence over artists and profits that no single man was supposed to have. He was the rare black artist who not only succeeded, but completely outplayed the system, and that made him dangerous to those who relied on control. Producer Rodney Jerkins, also known as Darkchild, who worked closely with Michael, once revealed that Michael lived in constant fear because of the catalog. He spoke often about being targeted, about people coming for what he had, and about how he felt he was being followed. According to Jerkins, this was not paranoia, but reality, and anyone who dismissed it simply did not understand the scale of what Michael possessed. These confessions, made in the studio when Michael thought he was safe, now echo louder than ever when lined up against Janet's shocking claims. What makes the story darker is that Michael himself had begun to openly call out industry leaders. He accused Sony executives like Tommy Mottola of being racist and manipulative, of exploiting black artists and spreading conspiracies. He was not silent about his battles. He made them public, and that only added fuel to the fire. When he declared he was leaving Sony as a free agent while still owning half of their publishing, the anger behind the scenes was intense. The industry wanted him under control, yet he was slipping free, and with his assets intact. For moguls, like Jay-Z and Diddy, who were aligning themselves with Sony and building their own empires in the shadows, Michael's independence was a direct threat. And according to Janet, this was the tipping point, the moment where Michael became more valuable as a target than as a partner, and the slow orchestration of his downfall went into full motion. The more you examine the sequence of events, the more suspicious it becomes. Michael's life narrowed, his family kept away, his dependency on pills increased, and the people closest to him seemed less like protectors and more like gatekeepers. He had once been the man who could buy entire catalogs with a single check, yet in the final years of his life, he was painted as frail, unreliable, and incapable of managing his affairs. The world was told he was a fragile figure who needed constant supervision. But what if that was exactly the narrative someone wanted us to believe? A narrative that made it easier to dismiss him, isolate him, and eventually remove him altogether. As the story unfolds deeper, the cracks in the official narrative begin to grow wider, and what seemed like scattered coincidences start looking like deliberate design, because right after Michael's death, a power shift took place that benefited almost everyone except his family and his legacy. The catalog he fought so hard to protect, the very catalog that made him a target, suddenly became the golden prize up for grabs, and it did not take long for vultures to circle. Industry insiders whispered that certain deals were already in motion before Michael even passed, almost as if people knew what was coming, and some of those very deals involved figures who had aligned themselves with Jay-Z and Diddy. Imagine the audacity of planning to divide a man's empire before his body was even cold. Yet that is exactly what appears to have happened, and the fingerprints of manipulation are everywhere. Jay-Z was quickly cementing his place not just as a rapper, but as a businessman with partnerships that strangely overlapped with the same corporate giants Michael had fought against, and the speed at which he gained ground in the business world. After Michael's death is something that still raises eyebrows. Suddenly, the man who once shared a stage with Michael was now standing alone at the top, hailed as the face of black entrepreneurship in music, while Michael's reputation was being buried under a pile of negative headlines. But the most haunting part of this story is not just the timing of deals or the rise of rivals, it is the eerie details that Janet and others have described about Michael's final months. Michael had become increasingly paranoid, telling people he was being followed, watched, and set up. He often said the industry wanted him gone, that his life was in danger, and while many dismissed it as the ramblings of a stressed star, the way events unfolded makes those words sound like prophecy. Friends recalled how he would refuse food if it was not prepared in front of him, how he mistrusted even his own staff, and how he would suddenly shut down conversations if he felt someone was listening in. At the same time, those around him painted him as weak and unstable, building a narrative that suggested he could no longer make decisions for himself. This dual picture of a man aware of danger yet simultaneously discredited as unreliable is chilling because it is exactly the kind of framing you would need if the ultimate goal was to strip him of his power and eventually silence him altogether. And then we come back to Conrad Murray, the so-called doctor who was supposed to keep Michael alive and healthy during the grueling rehearsals for the This Is It tour. Instead, he became the man who administered a cocktail of drugs that no responsible physician would ever use outside of a hospital setting. The question that still haunts fans is why Murray, a relatively obscure doctor with debts and lawsuits, was chosen in the first place. Who hired him? Who funded him? And why was he willing to risk everything to take on this bizarre role? Some reports suggest his salary was being paid by entities tied to AEG, but other whispers claim that his connections reached far wider, and that people in the music business had a vested interest in having someone like him in Michael's bedroom each night. The fact that Murray waited before calling 911, that he allegedly made phone calls to people unrelated to emergency care, and that one of those names was tied to Diddy, makes the entire situation smell of a cover-up rather than an accident. Meanwhile, Jay-Z was positioning himself with a kind of precision that felt almost cinematic. While Michael's children were grieving and Janet was publicly demanding answers, Jay-Z was sealing deals with Live Nation, expanding Rock Nation, and presenting himself as the new face of global music power. He became the artist who was suddenly everywhere, from fashion to sports to politics, stepping into a vacuum of influence at the very moment Michael was no longer there to overshadow him. Critics will say this is coincidence, that one man's death naturally created space for another to rise, but the way Jay-Z's rise aligned so perfectly with Michael's fall leaves too many unanswered questions. Janet has hinted that her brother's downfall was not random, that powerful players moved together like pieces on a chessboard, and Jay-Z's sudden dominance is too perfectly timed to ignore. And then there is the public itself, manipulated into playing its part without even realizing it. For years, Michael had been attacked by the media, every scandal amplified while his victories were buried, and by the time of his death, many people saw him as a tragic figure, rather than the genius strategist he truly was. This distorted perception made it easier for corporations and rivals to seize what was his, because the world had already been conditioned to believe he was incapable of managing it. Tabloids ran with narratives of debt and desperation, while ignoring the massive value of his assets, painting him as a man who had squandered everything when in reality, he still sat on one of the most valuable catalogs in music history. By the time the catalog was quietly absorbed into corporate hands, the public had been so distracted by salacious stories that they did not even notice what was happening. And who benefited from this narrative shift? Certainly not the Jackson family, who were left fighting just to preserve Michael's legacy, but rather the moguls who were positioning themselves as heirs to the throne of power that Michael once occupied. As more details leak out over the years, it becomes harder to shake the suspicion that Michael was systematically targeted. From the scandals that weakened him to the handlers who isolated him, from the doctor who failed him to the moguls who rose in his absence, the pattern is too consistent to be ignored. Janet's explosive suggestion that Jay-Z had a role in this wider scheme is not just about personal rivalry. It is about exposing how the industry operates in shadows, where friendships are masks and alliances are daggers waiting to strike. When you piece together the timing of Michael's warnings, the sudden changes in his inner circle, the strange calls on the night of his death, and the immediate rise of his so-called peers, you are left with a portrait not of coincidence, but of conspiracy. What makes the whole situation even more disturbing is the fallout that followed, because once Michael was gone, the silence from those who should have been demanding accountability was deafening, and the louder voices were the ones rewriting history to fit the industry's agenda. Investigations into his death were shallow, focused only on Conrad Murray while ignoring the larger web of connections that pointed toward a wider conspiracy, almost as if authorities wanted a quick scapegoat to calm the public rather than peel back the layers that would expose powerful figures. Murray was put on trial and convicted, but that conviction neatly tied up the narrative as if one careless doctor was solely responsible, leaving untouched the corporations, the moguls, and the executives who had everything to gain. Janet has spoken about how her brother deserved more than a rushed trial with one man in handcuffs. She has hinted that behind the scenes there were conversations, deals, and understandings that kept the truth from surfacing, because if the real players were exposed, the entire music business would have been shaken to its core. Imagine if the public had learned that one of its most celebrated businessmen, Jay-Z, had allegedly maneuvered to weaken Michael and benefit from his demise, or that figures like Diddy had people directly connected to the events of that night. It would have been chaos, lawsuits, government investigations, and possibly the unraveling of the very companies that control the industry. Instead, the story was managed, the fire was contained, and the public was distracted with tribute concerts, documentaries, and endless debates about Michael's personal life, while the transfer of his assets moved quietly into hands that were never supposed to have them. The consequences for Michael's family were devastating because they were left to fight a system designed to outmaneuver them. The estate that should have secured his children's future became a battleground of lawyers, corporations, and opportunists. And while his music continued to generate billions, the family saw only fragments of the fortune Michael had built. Janet's anger stems not only from the loss of her brother, but from watching how his empire was sliced apart and distributed among the same forces he had warned about. She knew Michael had always been careful, always strategic. Yet in the end, he was painted as careless and helpless, a narrative that justified stripping away everything he had achieved. And during this time, Jay-Z was celebrating deals with Samsung, with Live Nation, with streaming platforms, aligning himself with the very infrastructure that Michael once threatened with his independence. For many fans, the timing is impossible to ignore because the power vacuum Michael left seemed to be filled overnight by the very people who once stood in his shadow. The public reaction has been a mix of outrage and denial, because on one hand, people want to believe in the clean version of the story, the tragic accident, the lone guilty doctor, the untouchable moguls who had nothing to do with it. Yet on the other hand, the inconsistencies gnaw at the edges of that belief. How could a man who owned half of Sony's publishing just happen to die at the exact moment he was regaining control of his career? How could his final rehearsals show him full of energy and life while the narrative insisted he was frail and broken? How could calls on the night of his collapse go to bodyguards instead of paramedics? These are not random details, these are red flags, and the fact that mainstream outlets have largely avoided digging into them only makes the suspicions stronger. Fans flood online forums with theories, anonymous insiders leak fragments of information, and every time a new piece comes to light, the picture looks less like tragedy and more like design. Legally, the case should have sparked further investigation into the financial and contractual environment surrounding Michael at the time of his death. Yet that never happened. Government agencies that should have been interested in the movement of billions stayed quiet, perhaps pressured by the same corporations that profited from Michael's demise. There were whispers of inquiries, rumors of probes, but nothing concrete ever emerged, leaving the impression that the system closed ranks to protect its own. Had the truth been exposed, it might have triggered massive lawsuits, toppled executives, and possibly implicated artists who were supposed to be role models of success. Instead, the world was handed closure in the form of a single conviction and told to move on while the industry celebrated its new kings. And here we are years later, still asking the same questions, still connecting the same dots, and now with Janet's words fueling the fire even more. She has made it clear that her brother was set up, that he was surrounded by people who did not have his best interests at heart, and that Jay-Z was not an innocent bystander, but a player in a much larger game. Whether you believe her or not, the weight of her claims cannot be brushed aside because they align too closely with the suspicions fans have carried for years. If Michael's own sister is willing to risk everything by pointing fingers at some of the most powerful figures in music, then maybe the world owes her and Michael more than skepticism. Maybe it is time to admit that the greatest entertainer who ever lived was not destroyed by his own flaws, but by an industry that could not tolerate his independence, and by rivals who saw more value in his absence than in his presence. The story does not end neatly. It lingers like an open wound because deep down, we all know there are answers we were never given and questions that were never pursued. The legacy of Michael Jackson is celebrated on the surface, but beneath that glitter lies a darker truth that too many people are afraid to confront. And until the day that truth is dragged into the light, the suspicion will remain that Jay-Z, Diddy, and their allies stood to gain everything when the king of pop was silenced forever. So now the question is, where do we go from here? Because if Janet Jackson is right, and if the pieces of this puzzle really do fit together, then we are not just talking about the loss of Michael Jackson. We are talking about the greatest cover-up in music history and the possibility that the people we celebrate as icons of power and success may have climbed their way up on the back of betrayal. This is not just gossip. This is a story that affects how we see the entire industry, because if a legend as untouchable as Michael could be cornered, then what does that say about every other artist who dares to challenge the system? But here is where you come in, because the truth will never surface if people stay silent, so I want to know what you believe. Do you think Jay-Z had a hand in setting up Michael, or is Janet simply exposing shadows the world is too scared to face? Drop your thoughts in the comments, light up the conversation, and do not forget to hit like, subscribe, and share this video so the story cannot be buried again, because the more people demand answers, the harder it becomes to hide them.